Thanks very much and good afternoon to everyone. My name is Bruce Blackwell. I'm a local consultant based in North Vancouver, and I've worked in this fire space for approximately 35 years. I have been responsible for putting together the CWPP for the District of West Vancouver, and also assisting with the implementation of a development permit area, which we're going to talk about today. Development permit areas are not unique to West Van. They've been implemented all over the province, really to identify hazardous areas for building and development. There is often flood DPAs, environmental DPAs, and with the recent fire seasons that we've had in British Columbia over the last 20 years, many communities have implemented a wildfire hazard DPA, which really is focused on trying to get development to move to a condition of being FireSmart compliant. So I'm going to start off the presentation with a video, which is put together by the Insurance Institute for Home and Business in the US, and it simulates an ember shower, which is what we would expect in a forest fire. Most forest fires, it's not the direct contact of the forest to homes, it's multiple ignitions of multiple homes caused by the ember shower coming off the forest fire that results in multiple ignitions of properties and homes. So I'm just going to share my screen here and start the video, and I'll narrate the video myself. So can someone just confirm they can see the video?
Yes.
Okay, good. So basically this is looking at two things. One is landscaping and one is construction of the structure. The structure has rated roofing and unrated roofing. There's landscaping that is considered vulnerable. This is material that they're loading into the fan array, which will generate embers that will shower onto this home. And you'll see basically how the home ignites and what parts of the home are not vulnerable based on this ember shower. So here's typical landscaping that we would use in coastal British Columbia, some form of bark mulch. Those are azaleas, I believe. The ember shower here is generated with 5 ember generators, and they deliver a large number of embers to simulate what would be an ember shower in a difficult wildfire situation. I have to say, you're not likely to get an ember shower without an area of about 20 hectares on fire. So they simulate a 10 to 20 kilometer wind speed or mile per hour wind speed. Our wind speeds on average here in British Columbia are about 11. And you can see the house is being rendered almost completely in the ember shower. One of the reasons we put sprinklers on homes during these events is it creates a humidity bubble that puts those embers out before they reach the home. The vegetative debris, the pine, the mulch in the gutters and on the roof start on fire, and you can see that the aluminum gutters stay intact, whereas the vinyl gutters melt. And you can see that the landscaping material that's directly against the home is on fire. Here you can see in the next sequence of slides an asphalt shingle roof, which is Class A rated, against another type of wood roofing, and you can see the wood roofing will catch on fire, but the Duroid Class A will not catch on fire. So, and we'll talk about it shortly, but many of these same principles are embedded in the DPA. The untreated wood roof shakes are vulnerable to the spots or embers, and they cause that roofing to burn. So you can see that the dry vegetation in the corner ignited, and it goes up against the siding, and that's wood siding, and you can see the wood siding burns, but the hardy plank that's used on the side of the house and the front of the house does not burn. So again, we're comparing vulnerable siding to wood siding, which will burn in one of these ember showers. Important, so fiber cement siding, hardy board is good. Vinyl siding, you'll see here, melts and exposes the wood sheathing below. So vinyl siding is not good. You can see it melting on the right, and you can see the hardy board resisting fire on the left. Ultimately, the FireSmart process requires that you use 30mm screening on your soffits and your venting to the attic. Here's the reason why: these embers blow into the attic and start the internal portion of the house on fire. Fiberglass window screens allow ember penetration, and also vinyl and other types of windows will melt and will allow the embers to penetrate. So you want to have double glazed windows. This is single glazed, and you can see it coming in under the frame. If there were carpet, drapes, or anything, they'd start the house on fire. So I just showed you this to provide an example of why we're doing this. Why are these DPAs coming into place? And North Bend District has had one for some time, and now the District of West Van has got one. I'm just going to switch to a PowerPoint here, which we'll do here, and we'll start the real presentation now. So again, the workshop is really to try and inform the development community about what we're trying to achieve, how we're trying to achieve things, and to clarify questions and comments about the DPA, what is allowed, what's not allowed, are there any issues that we can assist you with? But really, the DPA has identified the orange area, any development that occurs within the orange area, which is in proximity to the forest in West Van, has to comply with the DPA. Why? Well, West Van has experienced historic fire. There are tremendous values in terms of the value of homes. And there's concern as we see events like the heat dome, the looper that's occurring in our forest, that risk is increasing over time. And the historic risk of fire probably has been classified as low to moderate, but there's two things that are contributing to its increase. One is there's a period, a greater period of high and extreme fire danger with recent long summers and droughts where we can have an ignition. And the second thing is there's more and more people that are venturing out into the forest that are also causing ignition. So we're seeing human ignitions going up, and we're seeing the period when those human ignitions could be started growing. Historically, pre-2000, we probably had about 35 days of high and extreme fire danger on the North Shore. That's risen to over 50, and it's been as high as 60 to 70 days in a given year. So you can see that there's rising concern about a significant interface fire occurring on the North Shore, and we have lots of fuel, particularly above the buildup area and within the riparian networks that travel down through our development, which really are a wick for fire in many cases. So I'm sure all of you have been exposed to FireSmart, and really the development permit is focused on controlling the fundamentals in FireSmart, which are the location and materials where homes are built, a subdivision layout, which is really focused on egress and evacuation, and proper allowance for the fire department to initiate suppression of any structural fire, and landscaping. So we're really looking at trying to make zone 1, which you can see in this diagram, which is 1.5 to 10 meters, the vegetation compliant with FireSmart. And we're looking that the home is to be built with non-combustible materials. And you saw the reasons why we want the non-combustible materials in that last video. Where there are trees, or where trees are allowed outside of the 10 meters, or even to some extent within the 10 meters, they should be pruned to a height of 2 meters, and they should have some form of spacing, and we'll talk about that later in the discussion. So Implementing the policies and objectives, well, I've spoke to that a little bit already. Climate change adaptation is a big focus. Longer, more severe wildfire periods. And this was a recommendation that came out of the Community Wildfire Protection Plan. And OCP policy was updated to address the risk of wildfires. We're largely speaking about new construction within the district. Obviously, we have a build-up area that it's not, old homes are not necessarily going to comply. But if you are dealing with an old home, certainly making sure that the roof is compliant with the DPA is a very strong and important issue, because the roofing alone generally results in a huge reduction in the risk of that home to a wildfire event. The other thing that the district is concerned about is we live on relatively steep sloping terrain. Removal of the vegetation exposes areas that are prone to landslides and debris flow for the probability of those events to occur. So in other words, there's a greater risk of landslides, particularly in the first to 10 years post-fire if we have a large rain event. So we're also concerned about this. Focusing on these principles conserves the ecological, aesthetic, and recreation assets of the district. And it's consistent with best management practices in the neighboring jurisdiction, which is the District of North Vancouver, which has had a similar DPA in place since 2012. So the effective enforcement, there is a requirement for development permits for private properties for new dwellings or habitable space or subdivision of land. And the applicant requires a qualified professional assessment, a wildfire hazard assessment. There is a period of staff technical review of the proposed building, the assessment, and relevant building materials. It is registered with land titles with a security deposit, and typically after the dwelling is constructed, there is a final inspection to make sure that both the landscaping and building are compliant with the QP assessment. Enforcement mechanisms to address that, the fire hazards. There is a fire protection and emergency response bylaw 4366, 2004. And that ensures ongoing property maintenance, and there are penalties for debris accumulation and vegetation overgrowth that do result in some form of fire hazard. So maintenance is also part of this. It's not just something you plant up the vegetation and leave it. Some thought is beneficial at the front end to decide what kind of vegetation should be planted. And there is vegetation that can be used that will result in lower maintenance and lower problems down the road. It applies to about 50% of private lots, and part of the strategy under the Community Wildfire Protection Plan was to move West Van to a FireSmart community, provide landscaping maintenance guidelines for existing properties, neighborhood education initiatives to obtain FireSmart certification, and that is underway as we present this. There have been several neighborhood education initiatives. The district itself is working to undertake fuel management on some district parcels of land. And as part of the Community Wildfire Protection Plan, there have been FireSmart assessments of critical infrastructure, schools, utilities, water treatment plants, and the fire hall. And those that have concerns about the assessments are moving to become FireSmart here in the near future. So the next part of the presentation is really focused on some of the key questions that come out of this. I'm sure that most of you have either been involved with the bylaw or about to be involved, but there are lots of questions that generally come up, and these next few slides are really focused on trying to clarify some of those things. So when a QP does a fire assessment, if the lot requires tree removals on steep slopes, and when I say steep slopes, I generally say over 30%, or if there are signs of stability concerns, there's erosion or exposed mineral soil, a terrain stability or geotechnical report needs to be completed by a geoscientist or geotechnical engineer, QP, to inform the wildfire hazard assessment and what trees should or shouldn't be removed from the property. And really, this is really focused on maintaining the integrity of slopes and making sure that if the wildfire hazard assessment is prescribing some form of tree removal, that's not going to cause any related stability concerns as it relates to the property. This, as I said, this report should be completed and provided to the wildfire hazard QP prior to their assessment. And this really is focused on ensuring that tree removals will not result in changes to slope stability, cause erosion, landslides, or debris flows. When we're talking about tree protection, protected trees should not be removed if they can be pruned above 5 meters above the roof, if they're overhanging the structure, and do not touch or impact the structure. So in other words, the root system is not going to affect the foundation. It's not going to become a hazard tree. So we're not prescribing that protected trees be removed. The QP has the ability to allow the protected trees to remain on the lot. Although the protected trees should be pruned to 2 meters so that if there is a fire, it's not going to easily spread from the surface into the crown. And below that protected tree, all fine woody debris, the material less than 12 centimeters, needs to be removed within the canopy drip line. And again, that's to reduce that material on the ground catching on fire and moving fire up into the crown. And this is particularly important if this tree is in any proximity close to the structure. The maximum number of protected trees to be protected is left to the professional's judgment. So if, for example, there were a cluster of trees that were on the border of the 10-meter priority zone 1, they could be retained. Typically, it really depends on the spatial location of those trees relative to the structure and relative to the size of the structure. Watercourses. Really, the development only requires review of the watercourse areas on the private lots, and we want to limit impacts to those watercourses. And we want to determine if any of the wet areas are considered a fire hazard. So stands dominated by deciduous species, alder, cottonwood, obviously they're not considered a fire hazard, and they would remain, they're not something we're too concerned about in terms of applying these FireSmart guidelines. The QP really is focused on identification of hazardous fuel types that potentially can be treated by thinning, usually of the small diameter trees, less than 15 centimeters, with some focus on retention of dominant trees, particularly protected trees, as I indicated. Small diameter coniferous trees should be the target of thinning within a watercourse as they act as ladder fields. So within the watercourse proper, we don't typically remove trees that are greater than 15 centimeters. We focus on the ladder fields. So that's removing the 15 centimeter trees, pruning the remaining trees to 2 meters, and making sure there's not a lot of surface fuel that's going to carry a surface fire. So those are typically the guidelines that we provide as it relates to riparian areas and or wet areas on the property. District properties. If the development property borders a district property, there is no mitigation or tree work that should be proposed. And that's really the requirement of the district to decide whether something needs to be done. Hazardous fuels on district property can be identified by the QP, who can notify district staff, and then it's an issue for district staff to deal with. Where appropriate, new structures should avoid being sited closer than 10 meters to district land with coniferous trees. So in other words, if it's deciduous, there's some leeway, but certainly when it's coniferous, we're trying to get that priorities 1 zoning of no conifers within 10 meters of the house. That's really because if the conifers catch on fire, they generate within 10 meters enough radiant heat to start any vulnerable part of the structure on fire. So that's where this 10 meter, in other words, the 10 meters is there because the heat load dissipates over that 10 meters, will not start the structure on fire. QP advice on structures. So changes, revisions to building materials must be approved and signed off by the QP. I've had numerous examples where we've written an assessment, the materials were agreed to at the front, and developers have decided to change them with non-compliant materials, and we can't sign off on those as a QP. Creates a huge headache for the developer, huge headache for us. And usually there's not a substitution alternative. And in some cases, it's come down to we've had to enforce the home being sprinklered as the only option to protect the house. All the building materials must be CSA approved with a Class A or B fire resistant rating. Any new building material must meet CSA fire test ratings prior to approval. So again, often developers want to use a new material. We can only approve it within the DPA if it's met these fire standards. And really, from the fire department's point of view, from our ability to do anything about it, the onus is on the developer and the manufacturer of the material to provide proof and documentation that it makes the fire rating and is CSA approved. From my knowledge, there are no CSA approved wood or wood composite shakes that are considered fire resistant in the long term. There are some manufacturers that advertise that they are manufacturing a fire resistant shake. Generally, they fill the pores of the wood with resin. And yes, you can put a torch to it when it's new and it will not light on fire. But as that resin breaks down over time, the resistance of the material degrades, and at some point will in fact burn. Green roofs are acceptable really only if the vegetation is non-flammable, and you would have to seek out an opinion to what would be considered non-flammable. But generally speaking, it's succulent vegetation, and grass is not considered non-flammable. Any of the grass species or anything that cures where it goes brown would be considered flammable. And so you have to be on top of what is succulent. Largely, you're probably going to have to irrigate to keep it succulent during the fire season so that the vegetation doesn't dry out and become cured. Landscaping, again, the landscaping must be non-flammable and can be comprised of native, non-cultivar, and ornamental plants. So one of the biggest problems is hedging. Cedar, juniper, taxus hedging are all highly flammable, and we don't want them in the 10-meter zone. We don't want long grasses, as they also are highly flammable, and particularly from a rate of spread point of view, the grasses spread very quickly and really tax fire suppression efforts because the fire usually is moving very quickly within a very short period of time. And if you followed any of the fires in the interior last summer, there were a number of subdivisions that were affected by grass fires that moved significant distances before the fire department even had a chance to get there. You saw from the video that bark mulch is also flammable and not acceptable. And if you haven't recently reviewed the FireSmart guidelines after the Fort McMurray fire, they were revised to incorporate a 1.5 meter zone 1A. And this is the non-combustible zone. We don't want any flammable materials within 1.5 meters of the structure. So that area ideally is free of vegetation, soil, and bark mulch, so that that area does not become a conduit to spreading fire to the structure itself. Hardscaping, obviously, wood hardscaping features such as decks or patios must have an approved fire retardant sealant applied. They must be rated, as I talked to you earlier. Decks are another important thing in the FireSmart principles. We don't want open decking that is not rated. So the decks are enclosed. Simplest way is to sheath it in and incorporate with the siding that's used on the main structure. Although wood fences are allowed under FireSmart, the panel or gate section adjoining to a structure should be non-combustible or metal. And wood end features are not allowed, and any materials need to adhere to the QP recommendations. So those are other important features about the hardscaping around the structure. So completed plans. If you expect to get approval of your building permit, you need to ensure that the wild hazard assessment recommendations related to the ancillary building materials, windows, eaves, vents, etc., are complete and are incorporated into the plans. If you leave out any of the important relevant information, it's going to get kicked back by the district to your QP, and they're going to be asked to amend your particular plan. The designer and the architect needs to provide the approved and FireSmart compliant list of building materials in their drawing package to ensure these materials are shared with and accessible to builders, contractors, and other consultants. So that's another important feature. So you really have to make sure that you've understood what your QP has assessed and the direction they've provided you, and it has to be incorporated into the plans. And you want to make sure that the plans are in fact complete.